I'm not drunk. I'm just this. This is who I am. Hello and welcome to another Just Saying, where I'm Jess and I'm saying things. This is our third episode of the year. And this one is another complete crapshoot because for once I'm doing the thing I never do and talking about an actual current game. Not like Elden Ring when I played it a year later or Cyberpunk when I played it a year later. I played this one before it even came out. So I'm just like slightly making my way back to being a current video game human. We're talking about Assassin's Creed Shadows. I'm not going to bury the lead here. Sometimes I do, but not intentionally, just because I ramble, which again, I'm not drunk. I don't drink. This is just who I am. I know it's hard for me too. But the lead that I'm not burying is the reason Assassin's Creed Shadows gives me the same vibe as Starfield is that, and we might need the algebra here, Dan. Starfield is to Elder Scrolls V Skyrim as Assassin's Creed Shadows is to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. That either makes sense and like, you're good. I'll see you at the next lesson. I'll see you at episode 4. But if you want to stay with me, I'll give you my reasoning and also talk a bit about the demo of the game. Because I played about 4.5 hours of it ahead of release at a demo session. The short headline of how I felt about it is I really enjoyed it. But what else did I love? Assassin's Creed Valhalla and all the AC RPGs. There's actually another video I made way early on in Just Saying, which is about, I think the Assassin's Creed RPGs are underrated, and this is another one, and I am stoked, but let's tuck in. Now, in classic Assassin's Creed RPG fashion, if you've played them, the setting and faces are overhauled, but the core mechanics will activate your muscle memory. That isn't to say there's not new things here, in the same way that there are loads of new things in Starfield, but it's got that same energy that is going to satisfy the existing player base who likes where those massive publishers have brought those massive properties to. Of course, Starfield is new IP, but I think enough people would see that it's really sharing the same general Bethesda RPG realm that it still does feel familiar. Much like I said about Starfield's brand new mechanics back in another episode. Oh, all these references to other episodes. There is and should be something to be said for what Shadows brings to the table, as I just said. Like, it's a finer approach to combat and stealth. The AI isn't oblivious anymore, which sucks. Like, it's good. You'll be happy. I think most people will be happy. You can't just sort of like snake behind him and kill everybody and they're all like, what happened? They do hear you. It's much more complicated. The interesting twist as well is that you've got Naoe and Yasuke, two completely different protagonists with different builds. You can't even spec into them in similar ways. Yasuke is absolutely built as a tank, which, trust me, if you have the lack of patience for stealth that I do, sometimes you're just gonna wanna be like, when it gives you that option for which protagonist you want for a mission, you just go, just give me the guy with a blunderbuss gun. I'm just gonna take everyone down. You'll feel properly rewarded for it, that I think previous AC games, particularly the RPGs, haven't established as a rule, because the AI has been way more generous in just, generous is nice, dumb may be the way that you would describe it, but they're smart now for better, and in some ways for me, maybe for you for worse. The option to power up attacks is also interesting. The way that you're engaging in combat is holding the trigger to create a more dynamic, and I hate using this Forbidden Games journalist word, but visceral? It does feel like a more visceral, heavier engagement in combat. A little bit less arcadey. So slightly less on the side of you needing to completely lean back on your build, which is how generally these really nuanced, granular RPGs work. And it's got that FromSoft, you actually need to execute things and be able to pull off specific Twitch action responses to come out on top in combat. It's not as simple as you just a higher level and you stomp them. It's all got a level of challenge that I don't think I've seen in an AC game for a really long time. The skill tree is also completely different. Still there, let me be clear, but completely different. It's got sections where you can spec into specific elements of your play style. And like I said, those are different from the two playable characters. And it's also interesting you can swap between those characters unless you're inside a fortress fortress or an enemy camp, which is exactly the same as how the other RPGs worked, because that counts as a non-save zone, and here a non-swap the character zone, which makes sense. So you're not just like morphing into someone else's body in front of a guy. Now that would be a completely different game from the AC RPGs. Now, if you play Valhalla, you might remember it has an enormous chart for your progression, for level progression, where you can spec into all kinds of different stats and abilities and buffs, and it's like 500 different points that you can pour into it. And for the purposes of this video, bit interesting that Skyrim also has a big constellation-esque chart assigned to each thing you can learn, each trait that you can work up within its RPG systems. When it comes to Starfield, this is just as complicated, but a bit more nuanced. It's shelved in a different way, where it feels like they belong to more discrete categories, and you can spec into things in a little bit more of a specific game-changing way, instead of these tiny little, you get, in the case of Valhalla, 1.5% bump in a stealth attack. Similar to Starfield, while at a first glance, because there's less things, it seems like it's going to have a simpler RPG progression system. But like Starfield and like Shadows, the things that you're choosing have more of an impact, which is kind of handy. So when you do get a point, you're not ending up with a very granular improvement on whatever it may be. Some tiny little thing you'll only notice when you get 10 of it, and then you have 10% added to whatever the thing you chose is. Instead, you're really framing Naoe as a stealth hero, or Yasuke as more of a tank hero, into the kind of character you want them to be within those umbrella headings. So that all said, why did I pick Starfield? Why am I comparing Shadows to Starfield besides my headline notes there? Well, I have to say that Shadows, despite all of these differences, which I felt like I needed to highlight first, at least some of them, this is an AC RPG through and through. If you haven't engaged with the RPGs in a while, or perhaps not at all, it may not be something you notice, and I think it will feel enormously different. If, however, you've played even Origins, but especially Valhalla, this is going to feel like riding a bike. And despite the fact that both games lean more into complex features and mechanics, they've still got that classic feel of the RPG belonging to their respective publisher. The worlds feel familiar, even though the settings are so far removed. And don't get me wrong, the settings in each of these games feel rich. There's no mistaking Starfield for medieval world just because the way that you play and engage will feel similar. Just in the same way, Japan is really cool. The way you interacted with the world, even the things that are in the world. You'll go to shrines and do smaller engagements with elements in the world, like painting some deer who are fighting. Sit down, paint some deer. A lot of it felt familiar to me, even though there's been upgrades and tweaks and a significant addition of challenge into the way that the game is played and the way that it feels to play. In Shadows, your diamond of 4 accessible powers for melee engagement and another series for ranged remains the same, as does your top-of-screen compass signifying your objectives and locations of interest. Starfield did move its compass from the middle at the top to the bottom, but I'm still counting it. Calling your horse while running in Assassin's Creed Shadows still usually initiates the same deeply smooth animation where it sweeps on by and you're running and then you just like swing atop it. And it's strange, it's just an animation, but that's been the case for a couple of games now in the RPGs, and it just feels good. It feels familiar, and maybe you'll enjoy that familiarity if you, like me, have been playing Naoe the Glass Cannon without having mastered her yet, and you are getting your ass handed to you. And now this is kind of a similarity, but probably even more far removed. It's sort of just the trend that AC RPGs have been taking, which is the present day stuff is pretty much gone. Valhalla already had very little of it, and launching into this one, it's got such a backseat. There's really no, at least in what I played, interrupting of your experience of medieval Japan, with Absego giving you a ring and saying you need to come back and read some stuff in the present. There's a couple of things that, while familiar, do feel a bit tweaked. Again, in a similar way that I would say Starfield feels really familiar but tweaked from the formula established by Skyrim beforehand. And I think one of those things is, at least from what I played, and I only played about 4 hours at this demo session and a pre-release build. At the very beginning, everything is set up to be pretty high stakes. You kind of get right underway with who these characters are, what their relevance is, what their backstory is, and that's all kind of heavy and intriguing, but there's a lot going on right out the gate. So it doesn't feel like it's setting itself up to be super silly, which like Odyssey did pretty much immediately. All that said, without discounting the bunch of changes and new features that I've pretty much covered and how that's elevated the RPG lineage so far in a bunch of ways, and that's really exciting to see. There's nothing worse than seeing new RPGs dumb down the complexity of their systems. And really interestingly, I think there was a huge trend of games being dumbed down, especially 10 years ago. And I would say, even with Skyrim, I was a bit disappointed because the RPG systems, their complexity was much more reined in than I think it was in Oblivion, and certainly from Morrowind. And I think that's probably just appealing to people who don't want it to be super complicated. And I get that. It's a lowest common denominator. These are big games. They're very expensive. They don't want to put people off. But I think it's really cool right now because, and maybe this is due to how successful From Software have been, or Larian with the system, I think particularly in Divinity Original Sin 2, where they didn't pick up the Dungeons and Dragons format, they created their own. And that game was fantastic, very nuanced and fantastic. And I think lots of RPGs are doing that now. There's a lot more discussion of what's your build? Like, how is this coming together? Not just how do you engage in the best way when you're on the ground, because it's not an action adventure. It's the whole point is to combine those two things, a challenge of executing and the challenge of creating a good build to begin with. And a thing that I think I loved and continue to love, 170 hours, have barely started Starfield. But the thing I thought was great about Starfield is that it kept the complexity. In fact, I think it one-upped the complexity, and Shadows is doing the same thing. There's less of a fear of, oh, people are going to be turned off if we make the systems too complicated, because both of these games are showing that you can take, and again, Starfield's new IP, but let's just talk about Bethesda RPGs. You can take the AC franchise, at least the AC RPGs, and Bethesda's RPGs, and they've re-entered a world where they're not getting simpler, like Mass Effect 1 to 2 to 3, where everything got really streamlined, and look, those games are great, but I think we can say dumbed down. Instead, they're kicking back on this like new wave of like people actually love their games to be complex and difficult again, and just challenging in satisfying ways. And I think that's so cool. And I think that's why I'm saying Assassin's Creed Shadows is like Valhalla in Japan. It's not a sledge. Though I think, and this is the point I made when I said Starfield is a lot like Skyrim, is I do still think, even though I really enjoyed all those things, and I'm keen to see what's going to happen with Shadows upon launch, what the rest of the game looks like, I do think the point still stands. If you didn't like Skyrim, I don't think Starfield is for you. I don't think upping the ante, upping the challenge, being introduced to even more complex systems, and all that having the undercurrent of your engagement feels just like a classic Bethesda RPG. And I think Assassin's Creed Shadows is very similar to Assassin's Creed Valhalla in that way. I think if you tried it out, if you found the systems inundating, if you just didn't like the way that you interacted with the world, and I think, again, is a size thing too, and I've talked about this in a different Jess saying, so many references today. If you found the world to be really big and that put you off, or you're not looking for a 100-hour game, this, in all those ways, to me seems very similar to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It's going to appeal to the kind of person who drowned in Odyssey, drowned in Valhalla. They'll be right at home, but I don't think it's going to pull in anyone who was turned off by those features that have been a part of every AC RPG so far and have only grown in size and complexity. So far, it seems like a really beautiful world to play in, and that's been the case. Actually, I mean, that's been the case for AC forever. By and large, almost entirely, even with Unity, which of course had a lot of criticism because of the thing where the eyes came out through the person's empty head. But for those who played it after the fact, picked it up later, like me, who didn't play Cyberpunk at day one, and because I played it so much later, was like, wow, well done. People did say that when all of that drama died down, there's still the beautiful world to play in there. Ubisoft are really good at that, and they're continuing to be really good at it. Interestingly, I also feel similar about Naue and Yasuke after playing this build to how I felt about Eivor in the 4-ish hour pre-release of Valhalla that I went to years ago. It basically left me feeling like she was kind of stiff, and I couldn't really figure out who she was, like what she was like, especially bouncing out of 200 hours in Odyssey where I fell in love with Cass. And Cass is very Cass right off the bat, or Alexios if you played Alexios. That said, when I did spend 200 hours with Eivor, I absolutely loved her by the end. So if we're going 3 for 3, I just need 196 more hours with Yasuke and Naue, and I will probably love them too. 3 for 3? 4 for 3? 4 for 4. It was tricky to follow all the story sequences, but that's sort of the nature of a work in progress demo because they let you play a little bit at the beginning and then they bounce you forward. So just knowing how to use all the different action bits and pieces, figuring out what your abilities are, and keeping up with how the story's been going in a crowded demo session with 20 other people is pretty hard, but I think that's sort of the nature of the beast with the size of RPGs that Ubisoft is doing now with AC. To be transparent, I also played using the Japanese audio, for which I congratulated myself and texted my friends to boast about, but it did result in me occasionally looking away from the screen, then remembering I do not speak Japanese, and so I lost track a little bit. ADHD. What are you gonna do? That's not a valuable takeaway, nor is it particularly relevant to this video or the headline of this video, but it felt like one of those things I was like, oh my God, guys, get this. So anyway, now you know. If you do want to ask me questions about the demo outside of how I reckon it's like Valhalla in the same way that Skyrim and Starfield are similar, please do drop them down there. I can do another video where I answer some of your more little nitty gritty questions, whether they're little or big or whatever, and maybe we'll do that if you have another questions. But I hope that this was interesting either way, and maybe an interesting little bit that you haven't seen on the internet so far since the previews have gone live. Naturally, I can also answer questions about why I can't just patiently stalk enemies as a stealth hero instead of immediately alerting an entire stronghold to my presence and running like a bat out of hell, but that's sort of just because. In any case, those are my thoughts at this stage. The game comes out in March, so it'll be good to have a chat about it then when you've got hands-on with it and you can let me know what you're thinking about it, because I'd love to know if I'm right. This is just speculation at this point, but it will be interesting when the game comes out to see. We can test the theory, test the algebra of how similar it really is to Valhalla, and not so much how similar it is, but the ways in which it's similar and different to Valhalla that I think meet the way that Starfield is similar and different to Skyrim, in ways that I think if you enjoy those experiences, the original ones, you'll really enjoy the secondary ones. And if those original ones, being like Valhalla, other AC RPGs, or the Skyrim games, if that wasn't your cup of tea, I don't think these ones are going to turn you around, unless you're looking for a bigger challenge or more complicated systems, in which I think both of these games have that on their predecessors. Thanks for joining me for another episode of, oh my God, guys, get this, listen to how this thing happened. I apologize for my rambling, as always, and my personality. And thank you for hanging out with me. If you've watched this far, you're amazing. I'll send you a heart in the comments. Send me a heart if you got this far. If you send one and you didn't get this far, then you've got that thing where you see ghosts. ESP? It's not ESPN. Anyway, feel like we've lost it. Feel like we've lost the plot. We should keep moving. I'll see you at the next episode.